conversation with our author. It's George Orwell's always popular, actually. Whenever we have discussions and debates, because everyone's read George Orwell, and George Orwell always seems to speak very directly to us, which is his great power as an essayist, also as a novelist. Right, so we've got 45 minutes, which actually is plenty of time, but we want to be on time because I've got to rush off to populism, which of course you will all need to come to as well, all of you. So we're lucky today because this is called Meet the Author. My name is Bruno Waterfield. I'm not an author. I'm a newspaper journalist. I'm a Brussels correspondent for the Times, and today we're very lucky because actually we're going to meet two authors. We're going to meet Chris, who I'll introduce in a moment. We're also going to meet George Orwell because Chris has written a book, You Do Not Exist, which you can buy upstairs for £5. As Chris put it, it's the cheapest book in the bookstore by some distance. So go and buy it. So make sure they sell out of it. So Chris is going to be talking about George Orwell, his book about 1984, which is excellent. So Christopher Snowdon, is the head of lifestyle economics at the Institute of Economic Affairs. He's an author of lots of books, really about lifestyle regulation, the new prohibitionists, and he's a regular writer at Spectator, critic. He's a brilliant writer as well. He's a really, really good writer. He's really worth following on Twitter too, because he's got a good sense of humour, which I hope will come across today. So, Chris, tell us why you wrote You Do Not Exist, and also tell us about last night.
Yes, well, I wrote it. It goes back a long way, actually. I started thinking about writing a book about 1984 well over a decade ago, when I started realising I was picking up quite a lot of interesting facts, really, just trivia about this book, and all the way it's been, the legacy of it, the way it's been used in all sorts of different ways, and David Bowie's Diamond Dogs and the film Brazil and all these things, and also the actual reasons why Orwell wrote it and how many things in the book are actually really specific, even though they might feel quite broad if you don't know Orwell's background. And it just got me thinking maybe I'll write a book about a book. And I put that on the back burner for a very long time. This is about 2011 probably I started thinking about this. I remember mentioning it to you actually, Rob, and we agreed it could be potentially quite a good pension because so many people read 1984. If 0.1% of the people read 1984, my book would do really well because lots of kids are forced to read it at school. And I never got around to doing it. And then a guy called Dorian Linsky wrote a book called The Ministry of Truth about 5 years ago, which was my idea. And I was like, damn it, it's done. And then I read it and it was really good. Make it even worse. And then DJ Taylor, who is a prolific biographer of Orwell, has written 2 biographies of Orwell. He then wrote a book about 1984 as well. So I thought, well, that's the end of that little scheme. Except for the fact that actually a lot of the things I wanted to say weren't said in either of those books. And so working for a think tank, I proposed the idea of doing a shorter book than I originally intended, which kind of laid out my thoughts, which I think there's 1 or 2 original observations. There's not many original observations about this book. Obviously, people have been discussing it for 70-odd years. But also the book itself and all Orwell's works went out of copyright a few years ago because it was more than 70 years since he died. So we realised that the IO had an opportunity also to republish the book. Various people have been republishing Orwell's work. They no longer need permission from the Orwell estate. And even Faber and Faber have now republished Animal Farm, despite famously rejecting it at the time because it was described as a stupid story about some animals who take over a farm and run it. And they said, we don't publish children's stories, Mr. Orwell. So, yeah, that was basically the reason. What happened last night is just I checked into my hotel because I was obviously doing a morning session here and I don't live in London, so I booked a hotel. And the hotel room they gave me was room 101. Which I don't know whether that's a good or a bad omen when discussing Orwell, but certainly in terms of sleep quality, it lived up to its billing.
So when 1984, it's almost everyone's read it. Kids are forced to read it. I think we were more or less forced to read it at school. Forced of it. Such a good novel. Such a good novel. So being forced to read it isn't a bad thing.
Go on, use it.
I thought it was all supposed to be sorted out and stuff. But anyway, so 1984. What does it really say to you? I mean, what you know? There's what you've got a gig. You're head of lifestyle economics. You've written a lot of books about regulation of lifestyle. Something Orwell had a few bees in his bonnet about. So what is it in 1984 that really speaks to you? Why is it that you wrote the book, and presumably why is it that people here should reread the book 1984?
I think a lot of people get lots of different things out of 1984. I think it's a very well-written novel, just as a novel. He had a lot of time to think about this because it took several years. He was laid up in bed with tuberculosis, presumably thinking about every element of this. And you can tell that it's been really well thought out, in my opinion at least, because there's just, as with a lot of Orwell's best work, there just isn't a word out of place. There's no slack in it whatsoever. In fact, there's a moment when Julia and Winston are in their little room that they've hired out, and Orwell sees a rat, and he makes a big deal about this rat. And at the time, it's quite jarring because it's like, well, this is an extraneous piece of information. Obviously, it's very relevant later on. It needs to get in this fear of rats, something that Orwell shared, by the way. But at the time, because everything else is so tight, it feels like that's a bit of a strange thing to suddenly put in there. So it's very tightly written. I think pretty well written. I know some people say that the characters are a bit thinly drawn. I kind of disagree, actually. Certainly compared to Brave New World, which is often compared to. I mean, it's 10 times a better novel than that, I think. And Brave New World is really just a bunch of silly jokes repeated again and again, in my view. So yeah, obviously people get a lot out of it. People see various things in it which were prophetic, of course, particularly things like video surveillance. What really interested me actually was trying to work out what Orwell was originally trying to say. And I know artists often say, well, you just get whatever you want out of it. But I was interested in what he was specifically trying to say. And again, he was trying to say lots of things. It was kind of the culmination of all sorts of thoughts that have been going through his head for 10, 15 years, ever since the Spanish Civil War. I think the main thing, if you had to summarize it in a few words, I think it's about objective truth and the war on objective truth. And that is only one reason why it has continued to appeal to people. But I think even more than the telly screens and some of the other stuff in there, which obviously was more pathetic than he probably could have imagined, because we have so much video surveillance now, and it's quite a kind of genius of him to even think of television as something that would watch people. Only 1 in 1,000 households even had a television when Orwell wrote the book, and CCTV barely really existed. But yeah, it's about objective truth, and he had this bee in his bonnet about this for many, many years. He was a journalist, and he should obviously be expected to take objective truth seriously, but he saw during the Spanish Civil War, he recounted that he would read reports about battles that had never happened, and there would be no reports about battles that actually had happened. He saw how people were literally being airbrushed out of history in the Soviet Union, and he found that, and he's repeatedly said this, he said he found that more scary than anything else, more scary than the violence and the terrorism and the murders themselves, the idea that somebody can decide what the truth is, and no one will ever be able to disprove it, because once you've taken control of the present, you've taken control of the past, and that's it then. And this idea really terrified him. So there are so many of his little. He's got little bugbears in there. He's got really big concerns that he was writing about, and he brings them all together in this incredibly dense book. And the funny thing is, you can ignore all that. You don't need to know anything about his beef with the Stalinists or anything. You can just read it as a horror or a thriller, and probably many people do. So I think you can get a lot out of it, and people obviously do, which is why it's still so popular.
Yeah, I think you have some real insights about Winston as well. He's a really curious character, in the sense of, who is he? What is he? In terms of his social position. And when Orwell was writing about this concern of us losing the ability to even think about the objective truth, let alone to discuss it, losing the ability to think freely, he was really talking about one group in society. That group were intellectuals.
Yeah.
And so he really sees, and this is why the book I think takes some of the forms that it takes. He sees intellectuals who are the ideologues, and he sees intellectuals and ideology as being the sort of worm in the apple, doesn't he? But tell us about Winston, because I think you actually, one of the really good strengths of your book is you've got some real insights into Winston.
Oh, thanks. I didn't know if I had really, but yeah, I mean he's Orwell, really, isn't he? I mean, Orwell's protagonists are nearly always Orwell, even in Coming Up for Air, where the protagonist is a kind of overweight, middle-aged insurance clerk. He still has a lot of Orwell's opinions, and he's remarkably self-aware for this kind of stereotype of a bourgeoisie. Winston is roughly Orwell's age. He's in love with a woman who is quite similar to Sonia, who he would go on to marry, although I think those similarities have been exaggerated by some people. He's very unwell. He's coughing all the time, which Orwell obviously was. And I would say he's not really a hero. He's not an anti-hero, but he's not really a hero. It's not even clear whether he actually is the last man in Europe, which is the original title of the book. It's quite possible, as far as I can see, that there are other people who have their doubts about the system. That's never shown not to be the case. He's just just a random guy, really, being put through the meat grinder. There's nothing particularly appealing about him. I mean, he fantasizes about killing Julia as soon as he meets her. He goes off with prostitutes. He's had some horrible relationship with his former wife. He's not a particularly nice guy.
He swears the oath, doesn't he, about acid into
right?
the
Yeah. Again, which is quite a jarring moment in the story. So there's nothing particularly heroic about him, and he doesn't do anything heroic either. You know, he never actually has any form of rebellion other than keeping a diary and hiring this room where he basically has an affair with Julia. But you're right, it is about the intellectuals. Everything Orwell wrote really was about the intellectuals. He wasn't that interested, actually, although he did have a lot of compassion for the proles. It's clear, more than anything, in 1984, it's very clear that he doesn't really understand working class life. And it's a very strange moment for me in the book where you suddenly realise about a third of the way through that the vast majority of people in Oceania are not spied on at all. They're just left to carry on, apparently endlessly just doing washing and singing songs and going to the pub. And they don't need to be spied on or except in extreme cases, have the secret police put on them because they're no threat to anybody, which is kind of a patronising way of viewing 85% of the population. But it was Orwell's view and the view of the Bloomsbury set and the kind of people he was always arguing with, that it's the middle class intellectuals need to lead the way, and if only we could get the proles to follow us, which they were always reluctant to do, we could have a revolution. Winston is basically the middle class, but obviously the middle class have fallen on very hard times by the time we get to 1984. Julia is extremely middle class. She's very jolly hockey sticks, isn't she, really? He was always writing about the kind of people he knew, and the inner party is essentially the middle class. But this is a huge swathe of people who he often uses animal metaphors for. I mean, obviously he did that in Animal Farm, but he's always referring to this woman that he claims to admire, this middle-aged woman putting out the washing all the time. She has mare-like buttocks and she's strong and ruddy-faced, but she has no intellect. I mean, he's actually more patronising to the working classes in 1984 than in the rest of his work. He never really develops his ideas very much, which I find interesting.
Yeah, I mean, because we can all argue about Orwell as well. He's 1984 is through Winston, so it's Winston. Like you say, Winston overlaps with Orwell, but surely, Orwell, wasn't, of the working class, went to Eton, didn't go to university though, which is very important in terms of some of his sort of hostility to the intellectuals and academia as well. If you read Politics and the English Language, I mean, it's a really, you can rejoice in the assault on sort of pompous socialist academics. But so what it is, I think, with so I'm kind of disagreeing with you a bit, Chris. I think that Orwell isn't of a working class. When he wrote to the Road to Wickham Pier, he travelled up north, stayed with people, didn't make him want to be working class, and became through those trips, he became interested in socialism, and the people who he met. And one of the interesting things about Orwell, I think why he's such a really great writer, is that he does see people as human beings. Now he has a very tortured relationship to the elite himself, imperial police, all that, Eton, the horrible sort of prep school, cramming school that he went to as a child. But he sees people as human beings. Now he knows he's not like them, but he has this essential equality.
Yeah.
So I love the bit in Road to Wigan Pier where he's coming back down from up north and he gets a train from Manchester to Piccadilly, and in the book it's pretty certain, I don't know if you've ever got that train before, he's going through Longsight. He describes it in Road to Wigan Pier where he looks out the window and he sees a woman unblocking a drain. The train's kind of ground to a halt, but it always seems to do that around Longsight. And they kind of catch each other's eye. And he realises in that moment, that gaze, that she realises, he's thinking, God almighty, please don't have to live like that. And she looks up and catches his eye, and he realises she is thinking exactly the same thing at that moment. And he's actually sort of made it up a bit, because it actually happened in Wigan, in his diaries, where he was wandering around and saw this woman unblocking a drain. So for Orwell, it's, he's interested in class because class is real, and he realises that it degrades people, and he identifies with people as another human being in the sense that he would not like to live that. He would not like to have that kind of fate. But while he's interested in socialism, which we'll come on to, I think, in a couple of moments, he's not really a socialist because he meets a lot of socialists who are middle class like him,
and he doesn't like them.
And he really, really doesn't like them.
Sandal wearing, nudist, fruit juice drinkers.
Exactly, and ideologues for I think, which is the great crime for Orwell of the intellectuals, is people who want to refashion other people to suit their prejudices, and that brings us back, doesn't it, to the heart of 1984.
Yeah, Orwell tried harder than anyone of his ilk to overcome his prejudice of the working class, but I think he was quite open about this, but he really couldn't. And again, it's clear in the book. I mean, he says, the proles, just as long as they had their lottery and their football and so on and their beer, then they were quite, you could do what you want to them. And he, like a lot of, left-wing writers of the 30s and 40s, he thought that the working class had a false consciousness, and if only they would rise up and see the sense of Marxist intellectuals, then they would overthrow the system. And he never really understood why there was so much resistance from working people. And I think his caricature of working class life, for somebody who has spent a lot of time with working class people in Wigan and elsewhere, it's kind of surprising. He never gives them credit for all the working class institutions that people had set up without any need from middle class do-gooders, and the football clubs and the temperance societies and the religious societies and all sorts of things. And the idea that all they wanted was gambling and football and beer. Lots of intellectuals thought that, but it's surprising that Orwell couldn't overcome that pretty basic prejudice, I think.
Right, we're going out to the audience, so let's see some hands up. Hands up. So we'll start with the gentleman at the front here, then there, okay? Keep it nice and punchy, and be argumentative, so we can come back to you even again, because when Chris gets angry, you can come back.
I'm curious if architecture had an influence on George Orwell, because for one of the anniversaries, or the last anniversary, I can't remember exactly, they had an all-day reading at Senate House.
So I was going to say Senate House, the Ministry of Love.
But and all the family were there. I think some read some parts of it. But the thing that struck me, I went in. It was a cold winter morning. I went in, and
April, and the clocks were striking 13.
Yeah, but it was the architecture. It was so authoritarian, and it would have been even more authoritarian in its day. And as I walked in, I sort of, and obviously going to this, I realized how that must have maybe even inspired it, the authoritarian state. And remember, Hitler wanted to use that very same building if he was going to be in Britain. So I'm just curious if you've even thought about that part of that, if the Senate building could have been inspiration.
Thanks.
Right, and then microphone back just behind you there, and then we'll come over to you guys over there.
How might his views have changed had he lived another 20 or 30 years?
Right, good. That's a good question. Now we've got. Start at the front there, please.
Two short questions, please. Have you read Christopher Hitchens' Why Orwell Matters, and what are your thoughts on that? And secondly, would you discuss a little bit about Newspeak and to what extent Newspeak is applicable today?
Okay, then just Rosie there, just on the. Yeah. Yes.
I just wanted to come back on your point about the working class not rising up and him being frustrated with that. But surely he does understand how they can't be led by people who lecture them about what to eat. And I thought that would be your way in, actually, because of your coverage of that. The Road to Wigan Pier, he talks about, having sugar in their tea, needing sugar in their tea, needing to go and have some chips, and not being lectured about, eating brown bread.
Yeah.
Yeah. Come back, Christine. If you just the microphone can then go to the two people behind. Come back quickly.
Senate House, as you may know, absolutely, was the direct inspiration for the Ministry of Love. His wife Eileen worked there during the war when it was the censorship, in the censorship department. Yeah, so much of 1984 is just directly taken from his real life. Winston in the book is basically doing what his wife was doing and what he was doing to some extent, because he was working at the BBC putting out propaganda. How much would Orwell have changed? Well, that's the eternal question, isn't it? And I'm reluctant to try and always claim Orwell for my own. I work for a Hayekian think tank. Orwell was not terribly impressed with Friedrich Hayek. He did read The Road to Serfdom, and he reviewed it, and he basically agreed with the first half, in which Hayek says that we are on a road to serfdom, and collectivism and socialism is not compatible with liberty, and it will lead to a class of elite bureaucrats and politicians bossing everyone around. He absolutely, that was his fear. That's partly what 1984 is about. But he just didn't agree with Hayek at all, that laissez-faire capitalism was the answer to that. How much would he have changed? I say in the book that, without wanting to try and claim and say he would radically change. Some people have said that he moved to the right in his later years, basically because of Animal Farm and 1984, both of which were then filmed by the CIA, literally, because they were considered to be, it was considered to be a good anti-socialist or anti-communist propaganda. I don't think he did. I think, in fact, his very last statement in June 1949, it makes it very, very clear that he is a supporter of the Labour Party, that he is a socialist, and people have misunderstood 1984. So he never wavered in being a socialist, but he hated actually existing communism, which at that time only did exist in Russia, and I think it was forgivable for people to say that the revolution's been betrayed, that the Bolsheviks, as he argues in the theory of the theory and practice of oligarchical collectivism in the novel, he basically suggests that the Bolsheviks never believed in socialism in the first place, and therefore ignore that experiment. There'll be other experiments to come. Now, had he lived another 40 or 50 years, he would have seen a lot of other experiments, and they all ended pretty much the same way. By the end of which, I would hope that someone like Orwell, who was always happy to challenge orthodoxies, would have maybe swung around and said, actually, the problem here is inherently with collectivism and putting a lot of power into a few people's hands, which he had said many times in the 1940s anyway. So I think perhaps he would have been less in favour of what was actually quite hardline collectivist views. If you read Lion and Unicorn, and one of the very few places where he actually says what he thinks socialism will look like in practice, it is not, some Lib Dem kind of bit of social democracy here and there. It is the streets will run with blood, and no one will be able to own any land in the town, and people will only be able to own 15 acres in the countryside, and the government will take over all industry. So it's basically communism. Hitchens' book, yes, I read Hitchens' book. It's very good, of course, and I agree with him on most things. Newspeak, it's all. Newspeak is part of his basic premise, which is that objective truth is under attack. And he argues that if you can't put things into words, then you can no longer think them. And actually, I don't actually agree with that. There is another article he published at some point in the 40s, in which it's kind of a weird article, in which he says there's all sorts of things in our minds that we don't have the words for, and we need to get a committee to come up with a whole load of new words. It's a really crazy idea. But that directly goes against what he's saying in 1984, which is that if you don't have words for things, you can no longer think them. But anyway, it's just, it's satire, isn't it? You've got to accept a lot of this stuff is satire. And finally, the socialists in the working class, he absolutely understood that the working class hated being lectured by middle class, sandal-wearing nudists and so on. But he thought that was his reason for criticising what he called the socialist movement. He still thought that the working classes could be brought on side by more sensible people like himself. And he did agree with the basic Marxist analysis that you would need to have the working class behind you for a revolution. And he agreed with the idea that revolution was inevitable and capitalism was inevitably doomed.
Yeah, but I mean, come on. So we don't remember George Orwell because he was a socialist. That was a sort of byproduct. George Orwell was a socialist. He absolutely was not a Marxist. There is no trace of any kind of Marxist theory, particularly Marxist with a capital M theory, which was heavily Stalinised at the time. There's really no evidence. I think that in his writings, I'm the chair, so I'm going to say something now. And so, Orwell was, he was a moral man. He was a moralist. And as a moral man, as a man who really believed in decency, and actually in very old-fashioned Victorian ideas about public service and decency, in many ways, he becomes a socialist, I think, because of that, because he sees some of the institutions of inequality, particularly of the sort of top-down nature of society, as being something that kind of violates people's own moral capacity. So Lion and the Unicorns are fascinating, but because it does seem now very left-wing, but actually he's not really arguing for a socialist revolution. He's arguing for England to be England, and the life that people lead, the life of these clubs, the horror that people have of the nosy Parker, the council who come and tell you what colour you can paint your door. That's really what he's talking about. So he's talking about, really small s socialism. He likes society. He thinks people are basically decent, or he wants them to be decent. He wants to be decent himself. So George Orwell, I think, is much more than a socialist. He's someone who, because of this belief in people's moral capacity, the glance he has with a woman, he really, really believes in democracy and freedom. So isn't that why we remember him? We don't remember him because he was a socialist, because that's antiquated, as the IEA is always telling us in this sort of wonderful modern Hayekian world. Isn't it that he's, has this really intrinsic belief, much more, the kind of way we would like to be, about freedom and democracy. Right, so microphones just on that row there. Two people there.
Okay, thank you. You alluded to it, Chris, when you mentioned Faber and Faber. I think it's really difficult to understand how politically and intellectually isolated Orwell was when he was writing. And it's pervasive today, so we've got a Pactor in for breakfast, but completely and utterly politically and intellectually isolated he was. And I think the right, after Animal Farm particularly, people of a right-wing persuasion have particularly focused on the freedom of the individual. And Bruno slightly pinched my point. I think what Orwell was trying to get at was organic communities and how the space for organic communities to emerge and have that organic sense of democracy. And he was British, very, very British. And I think you're wrong. English, sorry, okay. And I think you were wrong to say he dismissed the sort of 19th century Owenite way of organising working class life and cultural institutions, etc. I think he's very attuned to that. And I think the right, again, have traditionally seen it as much more around the freedom of the individual, whereas I think what Orwell's, particularly in Lion and Unicorn, is trying to get at is what can be an organic sense of English or British freedom and democracy. And I think that's where I think Orwell's strengths lie, and I think Bruno's right, that's where why we've got a packed room this morning.
So, microphone next to put your hands up, please. Right, okay. So, have we got 2 microphones? Yep. Right, so can we... There, please, yeah. And then we've got someone here first, though. So, take your turn. Wait. Go on.
All right, good. Thank you very much. What do people who work or have worked for the BBC think of Orwell, given the point you made about much of it is based on his experiences from working at the BBC? And also, quickly, what do you think he would have made of the European Union, given that I have seen firsthand the dark side of EU bureaucracy, particularly when working in Ukraine, and Ukrainians are paying the price in blood for that now. Thank you.
There.
I was going to ask the same thing about the BBC, but I'll ask a different one instead. I was thinking there are 3 great dystopias that were written in the 20th century. This one, 1984, Brave New World, and Zamyatin's We. In terms of the kind of way in which all of those reflect, I mean, do you think what's the read across from 1984 to those other, if you like, dystopias?
Yes, there. Stick your hands up, please. I want to see who wants to speak.
Hi, I found your thesis very hard to comprehend, really, that Orwell didn't have an understanding of the working class. The very point that he sees that socialism doesn't appeal to the common man is an understanding of the working class built on his experiences right through from Catalonia up to Wigan and all the rest. I mean, one of the things, the physical aspect of Orwell, which is very significant, it sounds very, left field, but he had a very sensitive sense of smell. And this kind of distancing, I mean, he was an outsider from his class itself, and he was an outsider everywhere because, he just physically couldn't get close to the stench of the populace at that time, and that affected him in India as well. But it sounds bad, but, it did affect him. And the language thing at the BBC is that was born of a project of cutting down the language for the Foreign Service on the radio, and that's how it generated into the newspeak, and it is a denudation of the ability to think by not having the words to do so. So that's why you might have thought of expanding the language to make that possible.
Okay, microphone. Hands up, please. Someone, do you want to speak?
Don't all of George Orwell's autobiographies and stories have strong dystopian elements in them? Isn't his literature basically quite depressing? Its obsession about dirt and peeling paints and rats and decay. It is all a bit much. I remember reading Keep the Aspidistra Flying. Man, that was depressing, that story. And even at the end, when he finally gets himself a decent place to live, it's because he's had to make huge concessions to becoming middle class. In other words, writing advertising copy and going to live in one of the new Metroland suburbs.
Happy, in fact.
He was happy but frustrated, yeah. I think. I just wonder if people find him as challenging as I did when I had a blitz of reading Orwell as a youngster.
I think, and one of the things I would recommend on that, so one of the really good things about Orwell is he's an essayist. He's the best essayist in the English language, full stop, so far. But he also wrote fantastic letters, and if you can get hold of it, I think it's like 4 or 5 volumes, his collected essays and letters. It's amazing, because one of the things you see in Orwell is he is a lonely man, and he struggles, I think, with all kinds of the kind of things we all have to struggle with. But one of the things that really comes across in his letters and his essays is he had a great sense of humour, and he's quite playful. So he's the guy who starts writing about comics, takes comics seriously. Why did he take comics seriously? He liked reading them. And this is the thing, he read comics. He read voraciously. He read everything. And so there's another side to Orwell, I think. And I think some of the things his son has said about him and written about him, and some of the things that people say about him. He was a very friendly, convivial man. He's incredibly loyal to people. He never ever tried to make political enemies. He'd always, at some point, after having a big falling out with somebody over politics, always try and hold out a sort of personal olive branch. If people rejected it, that was fine, but he built some friendships with political enemies, which were quite incredible. George Woodcock, who wrote an amazing book about him, for example. And one of the things I do think that comes across sometimes in Orwell, I think there's a bit of it. You point out that 1984, which is bleak, is not without its humour as well. So there, please.
In 1984, the primary mechanism of control is fear. In Brave New World, it's pleasure, and in books like We or Ayn Rand's Anthem, it's a lack of education and stupidity. I'm curious what you think the greatest threat to a free society is. Mm-hmm. Is it stupidity, is it pleasure, or is it total control and fear?
Very good question. We've got someone there, please. And then we'll bring Chris back. Yes, in the middle there. Matthias.
A couple of years ago, it entered German news that 1984 got a trigger warning in some university libraries, and just thought that because you said, well, kids these days are still forced to read it, but then you've got counter tendencies, obviously, putting a trigger warning in it. I just wonder how the state is in the moment, if you can still buy it or not.
Okay. Any more questions quickly? Chris, come in. Do 5 minutes and we can get another round of questions in.
Okay.
Don't do every question.
No, I won't. I'm trying to take a few of them and get it into one single
try and wind
answer.
people up a bit. I can see people
just
beginning to wake up.
Okay. I actually find Orwell's stuff pretty funny, rather than depressing. But I think he was negative. I think he had a negative outlook. I think he was very pessimistic. And that actually is my main thesis in the book. He was pessimistic, and he shouldn't have been quite as pessimistic as he was. Coming back, you mentioned We in 1980, Brave New World. He didn't like Brave New World at all, and he didn't try and pretend otherwise. And one of the reasons was he just didn't think that kind of society was appealing to people. He thought actually what people want is fear and war and aggression, and that was much more likely than Huxley's kind of hedonistic utopia / dystopia. He was depressed because, actually, I think, despite what you say, Bruno, this is where we're going to disagree. I think he was basically a Marxist. He did call his dog Marx, and I don't think he read a lot of Marx, but he didn't read a lot of any economist. What he did is he read a lot of pamphlets, and he had a lot of conversations with people. And in the 1930s and 1940s, Marxism of whatever variety was just the currency, and when people like Hayek and Schumpeter and Popper in the 1940s started writing books in which they were saying, look lads, I don't think this is going to work, and here are the dangers, which Orwell kind of got. He saw these dangers as well, but he still pressed on with his Marxist beliefs, and very clearly I think in the theory and practice of oligarchical collectivism, which is a bit that all the sick formers, when they read it, tend to skip, but actually he's really the heart of what he was trying to say, and that's why he resorted to this technique of sticking a book within a book, because how am I going to get all this information out there? But he thought this information was really important. It's full of Marxist tropes, really. There's a kind of weird version of the immiseration hypothesis. He talks about overproduction. He clearly believed that capitalism was inevitably doomed. He said this again and again in the the Lion and Unicorn. He says, at normal times, a capitalist economy can never consume all that it produces, so there is always a wasted surplus and always unemployment. In time of war, on the other hand, it has difficulty in producing all that it needs because nothing is produced unless someone sees his way of making a profit out of it. That's a classic Marxist analysis. He then says, in a socialist economy, these problems do not exist. The state simply calculates what goods will be needed and does its best to produce them. That's where he went wrong. I mean, a lot of people believe that, but that's basically the problem, as pointed out by Mises in the 1920s. It's called the socialist calculation problem. Without profit motives and price signals, you have no way of knowing how much is needed to be produced. And so actually, it's under socialism, there's always overproduction or underproduction and poverty. And he never got that. And I think it's very important. He never really read any economists, including the great, people like Adam Smith, Alfred Marshall, didn't even really read Keynes, who was by far the biggest economist of his day and was kind of on side with a lot of what Orwell believed. And he didn't read the left-wing economists either. He didn't think very much about socialism. He just assumed that capitalism was doomed and the only thing that was going to replace it was socialism. And if socialism inevitably replaces capitalism, as far as he saw it, there was a fork in the road. On one hand, you had totalitarian communism, as already existed in Russia, or you had his version of libertarian socialism, which even he admitted wasn't very likely to happen, because people, actually, as far as he was concerned, do want some form of oppression and hostility and war and aggression. And so he was very pessimistic about libertarian socialism coming about, and therefore he assumed that totalitarian socialism was going to come about instead. And that was what the warning in 1984 was. It was, capitalism's a dead letter, let's pick the libertarian version of socialism.
But I mean, what you've just really spelt out is the fact that he was not a political theorist. He was not a political theorist.
Well, he wasn't a very good political
No,
theorist.
he wasn't.
But, I mean,
But he wasn't.
the theory and practice of oligarchical collectivism is absolutely political
Yeah,
theory.
but he's not. We don't remember him for being a political theorist. We actually remember him for being essentially a moral writer,
Sure,
a moral philosopher, if anything. I have to say, because it's when he called his dog Marx, he was doing that to wind up
Quite possibly, yeah.
wind up left-wing intellectuals who were thoroughly Stalinised in Britain. You were not a Marxist. There are tiny groups of Trotskyists in Balham and places like that and up north, but they were really small. And actually, they often lived in fair. They actually lived in fear of their lives to a certain extent because Stalinists were all around them.
Mm-hmm.
The left was thoroughly Stalinist. So call your dog Marx to write homage to Catalonia made him. One of the things that's really fascinating about him is he's still the enemy. There are still quite big Stalinist parties in Latin America. For example, what's absolutely fascinating is how they really hate Orwell. They really, really hate Orwell. The Stalinist left really, really hated him, and in many ways it damaged his career prospects.
He did in Spain. He did fight for the Workers' Party of Marxist Unification.
He did. He fought for them, more or less by accident, because the letter of recommendation he got was from the ILP, and the ILP were affiliated for all kinds of bizarre reasons with the POUM. He actually wanted to transfer to the international brigades because they were more disciplined, a bit more of a sort of model of a public school version of a workers' army. In fact, it was very lucky he didn't, because if he had gone and joined the international brigades, he would have disappeared in a cellar somewhere in Madrid in 1937, 1938, and we wouldn't be having this conversation. There would be no Madrid. Right. So one very, very quick. Anyone got a last final question? No? Oh yes. Yeah. Good. Right here and then back there. So back, one microphone to the back and one microphone there. Look behind you. He's trying to give you the mic.
Thank you. Not quite sure how to put this one, but why does my lefty son not understand what all the fuss is about?
With what? With Orwell?
With Orwell, yeah.
Oh,
Good question. And then at the back there.
I'm certainly in favour of capitalism in principle, but I would say that there's a danger that capitalism might be the source of its own demise, and I'd like to illustrate that by saying that, in my view, the COVID response was pseudoscientific, debt-ridden and deadly, and has cost us to the tunes of billions, where money's been taken from the less well-to-do, the already wealthy, and that there was a war on truth that enabled that process to take place. And now with net zero, climate alarmism, we're going through the same process, pseudoscientific, debt-ridden and deadly, that there is a war on truth, and a great deal of money to the tune of trillions is being taken from the less well-off to give to the already wealthy.
Right, Chris is going to sum up in a moment. Thank you very much. I just want to read you something that Orwell wrote. So we talk about what kind of man was he. He wrote a fantastic essay on Charles Dickens. It's a really beautiful bit of writing, and he ends it, and you really realise that he's kind of writing about himself as well. And so he talks about the fact that Dickens, the photographs that we have of Charles Dickens, don't really resemble him, his kind of character. And so he finishes the essay by saying, talking about Dickens, he's laughing, but with a touch of anger in his laughter, but no triumph, no malignity. It is the face of a man who's always fighting against something, but who fights in the open and is not frightened. The face of a man who is generously angry. In other words, of a 19th century liberal, a free intelligence, a type hated with equal hatred by all the smelly little orthodoxies which are now contending for our souls. And whenever I read that, I see George Orwell. I don't see Dickens. And it's clear that he's, through talking about Dickens, and it's a really wonderful essay, and it really gets at Dickens, because Dickens actually, again, is someone who needs to be rescued for our times. But one of the things that's fascinating about Orwell is quite often when he's writing and gets passionate, he's talking about what he would like to be like. And I think it's one of the things I really love about Orwell, because you know he's not like that, because none of us are. And yet that little bit at the end there where he's writing about Dickens, and you think, that's Orwell. That's how Orwell would like to be remembered. Right, Chris.
Yeah, I hope I'm not giving the impression I don't like Orwell. I just feel like I've been too critical of him. I think that would be what he would hope for and expect, to be fair, Orwell. Orwell, start a fight in an empty room, and he was always very happy to criticise people quite viciously and then be very nice to them and be surprised that these people were upset that he's just dedicated 20-page savaging. I just wanted to say that, Orwell is fantastic and I love reading him, but he was wrong about an awful lot, and he made a huge number of ridiculous sweeping statements, some of which are amusing, like, all tobacconists are fascists, and other things like, liberal democracy is obviously
blowing up Twickenham was one of them,
more important. Yeah. Yes, indeed. And he couldn't have known, perhaps, that he'd already lived through the worst of the 20th century, but he really had. And you can understand why he was so pessimistic when you see what he'd been through. There's 2 world wars, the depression, he'd fought with the Spanish, he'd seen the revolution as he saw it betrayed in Russia, and now we had the atom bomb. No wonder he was pessimistic about things. But it turns out he shouldn't have been, and I try in this to explain why he perhaps could have been a little bit more optimistic about democracy and indeed capitalism. So although I think he was wrong about the sort of geopolitical side of this, I think he demonstrably wrong, in fact, the reason the book persists in appealing to generation after generation, perhaps not your left-wing son, whoever that was, but to most people, is that the concerns that he had are pretty much timeless and are always likely to remain so long as governments exist, really. And it does come back to this question of objective truth, and whether it's COVID or climate change or all sorts of other things, or Donald Trump's fake news and so on, or CNN's reporting of what have you. There are always going to be people who say, God, that's Orwellian, because you're challenging objective truth. The problem is, as Orwell I don't think really fully acknowledged, is objective truth is actually quite hard to define and not always necessarily distinguish. And clearly, Orwell's view of objective truth, if he thought that objectively all tobacconists are fascist, then I think there is you can have a legitimate question and legitimate debate about objective truth. So yeah, there are good reasons to be concerned. Things like Wikipedia, where people can just change the facts, and whoever's in charge of the page and wins that battle gets to decide effectively for millions of people what objective truth is going to be. That's the kind of thing you couldn't even foresee, but it's very similar actually to the memory hole and the Ministry of Truth. So look, as Orwell said in the book, it's a warning, not a prophecy, but it is a conditional prophecy in effect, and all we can do is remain vigilant. It depends on you, as he said.
Right, thank you very much. Yeah, thanks.